One word that is synonymous with Joseph Stalin, the dictator of the Soviet Union, is purge. He was a leader who executed scores of his own population and people, and millions were killed during the Great Purge and other ruthless actions by Stalin's execution squads. Men and women of any age were not exempt, and one woman who was condemned and was shot during the Great Purge was Rose Cohen, a woman who was born in London. However, she was a staunch communist, and she became a founding member of the Communist Party of Great Britain, but she ultimately incurred the wrath of Stalin, and in 1937 she was executed for her actions. Join us today as we look at the execution of Stalin's female English enemy, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Rose Cohen was born in the East End in May 1894, and her family were Jewish, who had come from Lodz in Poland. Her father was a tailor, and he had a successful business in London. However, Rose was a woman who was captivated with politics at a young age, and she was obsessed with the ideas of the Communist Party. She learned through the Workers' Educational Association all about politics and economics, and she also learned 3 different languages. However, following her schooling she left home and lived with her sister Nellie, and the pair were then active members of the suffragettes that were led by Sylvia Pankhurst, and Rose's sister was even one of her private secretaries. However, due to the actions with the suffragettes, in 1916 the British intelligence services kept a very close eye on Rose, and they intercepted letters and obtained information regarding her telephone calls that she made. But then Rose worked at the London County Council, and she worked there for a few years before moving to the Labour Research Department. She served under many important economists, but at the end of the First World War her department became a place that was being run by left-leaning young thinkers. Cohen was described as having a great vivacity and charm, and was one of the most popular persons in the movement. But then in 1920 she was a founding member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. She was highly educated, intelligent, and many believed that Rose was beautiful, but she was focused on politics. She then in the 1920s worked as a Comintern agent, travelling to different countries carrying messages and transferring money between the different communist groups around the world. In 1922 she spent some time inside of the Soviet Union, and she also visited countries such as Germany, France, Turkey, Sweden and Denmark. She transferred huge sums of money to the various communist parties in these lands, but in 1925 she then worked inside of the Soviet embassy in London. But whilst inside the embassy, Rose continued to handle large amounts of money, and she then met her husband, David Petrovsky, and the pair later married. But in 1927 Rose Cohen then travelled to Moscow, and she joined the Russian Communist Party. 2 years later she married Petrovsky and then gave birth to their son Alexei, and she spent 6 months travelling to China, Japan, Poland and Germany. In 1930 she became a student at the International Lenin School, and she was then employed as an editor of the Moscow Daily News. She was carving a career for herself in the Soviet Union, and many considered Rose and her husband the golden couple of the expats who were living in Moscow, and many people would attend their apartment for parties, and they would have strong links to many other people who had moved to the Soviet Union. But at this time there was a significant degree of terror inside of the Soviet Union, and Rose's husband knew that there was danger ahead after Sergei Kirov was killed. Following the assassination, Stalin launched a Great Purge, a huge crackdown on people who he believed were dissident and outspoken against Stalin and his government. The NKVD, the secret police, would enact Stalin's brutality, rounding up scores of people who were then shot dead inside execution chambers. Rose seemed brash to begin with when confronted with the worries of the Great Purge, and she then in 1936 went to London, and she was not allowed to travel with her son, but this made her very unhappy, and many believed if she had taken her son with her, then she would never have gone back to the Soviet Union. But because she was without her son, she had to return. However, her husband at the time received permission to travel abroad, and his boss knew Stalin closely, and he wanted to protect and save David Petrovsky and Rose and their family. He wanted David and Rose to leave indefinitely and immediately and to travel to America. However, the pair could not get an exit visa for their son, and they could not leave without him, so they stayed in the Soviet Union. But then in March 1937, Rose's husband was arrested, and Rose Cohen was then expelled from the Russian Communist Party. But then on the 13th of August 1937, she was arrested in Moscow. She was accused of being a member of the anti-Soviet organisation of the Comintern, spying for Great Britain and the residents of British intelligence. As she was British, she was treated with suspicion, and she was accused of being a spy, passing information about the Soviet Union back to the British. However, this was of course not the case, and this would be the excuse that Stalin would use to order her execution. She continued during her imprisonment to deny all of the charges put against her. However, she was then taken to a closed court hearing on the 28th of November 1937. Cohen was not allowed a defence counsel or any witnesses to testify for her, and it was said that Rose pleaded not guilty, denied all charges, and refused to confirm her testimony given during the preliminary investigation, claiming it was false. But in her final statements, she continued to say she was not guilty. However, 20 minutes after the legal proceedings began, she was declared guilty, and she would be executed just hours later. In many courtrooms, to make proceedings quicker and executions more swift, there were often execution chambers connected to them, where an NKVD executioner would be waiting with his weapon. Some of these chambers were designed in a way to execute quickly, and they were even built with sloped floors to make them quick and easier to clean and tidy following the execution. As with the Great Purge, the final details regarding Rose Cohen's execution are not the clearest, and it's believed that inside a Moscow execution chamber, she was shot in the head by an NKVD executioner. Her husband had been executed a couple of months earlier, and their son was then placed into an orphanage and was labelled the son of the enemies of the people. It was told that Rose had died of pneumonia, but this was not the case. When she had been arrested, British communist leaders appealed to try and get her released and sent back to Britain. However, they were told and advised not to interfere. There was no protest because of this, and the British government at the time did not deny the belief that Cohen had become a Soviet citizen at the time of her arrest, but this was not the case, and she had not become a Soviet citizen. This could have saved her, as she remained a British citizen. However, ultimately she was executed inside an execution chamber by gunshot. She was one of millions of victims of Stalin's Great Purge, and this action helped Stalin to reinforce his brutality and power, meaning no one would dare question him and his politics. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.